Hey everyone, welcome to the July video. Getting this one done before the end of the month, but not too soon. I originally was going to do a COVID math thing, but I actually want to hold that off till October. Last October I did a COVID math prediction thing, and you should go watch it. It's kind of, it's a downer, but COVID's a total downer. But I made a prediction in it, and sadly the predictions come true, or very close to coming true. But anyway, what I want to talk about this one, I'm just going to do one of these walkabout videos. I figured take you with me. We're getting some decently nice weather in Riverside for the summer. It's only in the high 80s, which for us is quite nice. Today, I want to talk about the consequence of the technology of tomorrow. And I mean tomorrow, not the far future, not 20 years. I mean, we're going to start to see these changes literally next year, and in some places, literally tomorrow. But just a little change tomorrow, but definitely over the next 10 years. For my January 2020 video, I uploaded January 1st, 2020. I predicted driverless cars. And I predicted they're going to be the big thing of the decade. That's what's going to kind of change everything. You know, the internet changed the 90s. You know, what made the year 2000 so much different than the year 1990? Well, it was the internet. The internet really kind of took the whole world by storm. What's it going to be this decade? Driverless cars. It's actually going to be several things, but I think it's going to be the big thing where if you were in a 10-year-long coma and you came out, the big thing that'd catch you is, wow, everyone's getting around in something you've never seen before. Now, I don't want to actually talk about the technology itself, because the truth is, I don't really know much about it. I know they use LiDAR, and I just know it's kind of like the internet. And in the late 90s, I'm 14 years old at the time, my friends and I would sit around and we would talk about our favorite little tech companies. We'd talk about Alta Vista and Lycos and Ask Jeeves and Yahoo. And I'm trying to think of a bunch of other ones, but there was a lot of them. There was a ton of these little companies. And we likened their success to the success of the internet. What would become of the internet, what would become of those companies would be what happens with the internet. Now, if you're young, you probably never heard of a lot of those companies other than Yahoo because they all failed. Or they became something tiny if they're still around. But the internet didn't fail. In fact, when the dot-com bust happened, many people actually thought that, okay, that's it, the internet's done. It was a nice little demo, you know, it's a good way to get some pornography. But other than that, not really anything serious. How were they ever wrong? I think we're going to see something like that with self-driving cars, where people are trying to figure out what company's going to make it. Is it going to be Google with Waymo? Is it going to be General Motors with cruise automation? Is it going to be Tesla with their full self-driving and their eventual auto taxi product? I honestly think that discussing what company is going to ultimately be the most successful, or is going to be how it's all going to work, is kind of unnecessary. And it's much like talking about Alta Vista and Lycos and Ask Jeeves and Be Seen, if you guys remember that one. That's a real old school one. Which one of them is going to be the success story of the internet? When it turns out really none of them were. But that doesn't mean the internet didn't happen, and you shouldn't look at the failure of a company as being the failure of an idea or a platform or an infrastructure. Ooh, what is that? Oh, just a little rabbit. I have to be on the lookout for snakes. I do not want one of them to bite me. They don't want to bite me though. That's why I'm kind of being a little loud, so they can hear me and kind of scurry away. But I digress. The fate of the internet was not the fate of those companies. In fact, many of the biggest companies, the founders, were in high school at the time. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg's my age. When I was 14, he was 14. He would go on to create the big, one of the biggest internet success stories, you know, after all those companies went out of business or got bought up or absorbed or whatever. So I really think talking about individual companies is a good idea to get the ball rolling. And people need to see that the ball is rolling. But that's not the winner takes all. There's going to be a battle. What I really want to talk about with this video is how is this going to change the world? Something I've kind of realized is that many people on the left and many people on the right both like this idea of driverless cars and they despise the idea of driverless cars. People on the right, they more traditional, they want the cars that they know and you know they're familiar and we know we just want better ones. Hey, how about a better F-150? And Ford will make you a better F-150 to get better. And people on the left are strangely traditional as well, and in a way are strangely conservative. And what it is they say, oh, we don't need driverless cars. What we need is just mass transit that's so good you will never need to drive because the train literally goes everywhere. And it's like, well, I think mass transit between high capacity spots seems to work quite well. And yeah, we definitely need more than that, but everywhere, meaning you'll never be more than, say, a mile away from a mass transit hub? It seems a little unrealistic to me, especially here in the United States. I don't think you're going to get it to where every neighborhood in Texas is connected by the train. It sounds a little silly to me. I don't think it'll ever happen, but that doesn't mean that, hey, going from, you know, downtown Austin to downtown Houston, you know, and stopping along the way isn't a good idea. It's probably a fantastic idea. But the big thing is I think they're both wrong. And I think they're both wrong for the same reason. They're not expecting how self-driving cars will actually work. They're thinking, well, a self-driving car, it'll be like a car that you have today. You go and you buy it, and then you store it in your garage or parking space or out on the street or driveway. Then when you want to go somewhere, you get in, you tell it where you want to go, and it drives you. It's basically like it is today, except you get to relax while it does the work. No different. And the reality is, well, I think there will be people who buy such a thing. That's not the change. That right there doesn't really change society very much. Yeah, you'll have safer drivers. Yeah, it's more relaxed. But in the end, it's gonna look exactly like how it does today. For every house you see on your street, there'll still be 2 or 3 or 4 cars parked in front of it. When the reality is, it's gonna be nothing like that. I'm convinced how this is really gonna happen is not you can buy a $50,000 vehicle, but I think there's a bee flying around me. But you can order a ride, like an Uber or a Lyft. In fact, it'll be just like Uber or Lyft, but you will not have a driver to pay or to tip. The inside of the vehicles will probably be, I mean, they will be different. They'll look completely different than the current cars. And there'll be no gasoline because they'll all be electric. But the question is, well, you know, like electric cars, who can afford an electric car? They're so expensive. Well, nobody can afford people can afford electric cars, obviously, but who can afford an electric ride? And now we start to get into a different business model, different math. And they're not trying to sell you a $50,000 car or a $100,000 car. They're trying to sell you a $2 or $3 ride. And it comes from something that nobody can afford this, or barely anyone can afford this, or only rich people can afford this, to, hey, that's cheaper than driving yourself. And I don't want to get too into the details of why it's cheaper. I think I did that, my 2020 prediction video. But I want to kind of go on my predictions on how will that change society. And let's kind of look at this. What's the advantage of a car? The advantage of a car is point-to-point transportation on demand. You can go wherever you want to go, whenever you want to go. So as long as there's a road that takes you there, you can go there. What's the downsides? Traffic, that's a downside. You got to store the car, which means you need a garage, which, you know, in suburbia is not a big deal, but in a big city, that's a total pain in the ass. There's, you know, pollution. There's the cost. I mean, you get a reliable car, it's not cheap. You got to pay for insurance, you got to maintain it. There's a lot you have to do. And then, you know, on the societal level, if everyone has to have a car, you don't really build walkable areas. You know, if you notice, I watch Not Just Bikes, and I love that YouTube channel. He says, you know, like, really, you need a walkable, bikeable area where you live and spend most of your time. And so you don't need the car for your day-to-day life, which I agree. But let's kind of look at the advantages of mass transit. You can move a lot of people, and it's usually pretty cheap. Well, not so much. I think if you're going from where I live in Riverside and you take the mass transit to LA, you basically lose all cost effectiveness as soon as you carpool with 2 people. So if you're 2 people using mass transit versus 2 people driving, there's no cost difference. I think, anyway. I can't remember. I know I have friends who are families. They tried it, and it's like, yeah, it costs, you know, $100 for the family for the train for the day, and it's like, yeah, the car's cheaper. But what are the downsides? Well, it's only certain points. It can't take you everywhere. In fact, there'll be many places you want to go. It just doesn't go. It's not trains, but buses are much, much slower. Where I live, they're about 3 times faster than walking, but about 1/3 as fast as driving. And they're expensive to build. Like I say, they have upsides, they have downsides. Well, let's look at these driverless taxis that I'm talking about. Well, they have the upside of a car where you can go wherever you want to go, whenever you want to go. It's a big upside. But they have the upside of a mass transit where you don't actually have to own it. You're just buying the ride. And they have the upside of mass transit where one vehicle serves many people. So it's not just your car only serves you. It's you order a ride, you take it somewhere, you get out, now it's taken someone else somewhere. And, you know, instead of 1 car per 1 person, it's 1 car per 10 people, or maybe in San Francisco or LA, it's 1 car per 20 people. It leaves the option of pooling a ride where you can ride with other riders and everyone pays a cheaper price. It eliminates pollution, the air pollution. But I think the big thing we're going to see is, if you don't need to own a car, what do you need to own a garage for? I mean, your workroom where you can store crap in it, but I mean, I think that is going to be a huge societal shift. Is this type of transportation eliminates a type of living. Modern suburbia in the United States was built on the idea that basically for every bedroom you're going to have a car in the house, at least, you know, as it is now. At least 1 or 2 cars for every home. So you have to build accordingly. And if you look at people's objections to new housing, what is usually based around? Traffic and parking. You can't build a new apartment building, the traffic will be bad. Where's everyone going to keep their car? You know, a downside of living in the city is that parking's a pain in the ass. If you're a builder and you're gonna build an apartment building, you need to basically plan for every single unit in that apartment building. You probably have to have 1.5 cars or more. So if you build a 100-unit building, you need 100 parking spaces, and probably more like 150 parking spaces. And it really gets inefficient once you scale up. What if you have a 500-unit building? Well, now you need 700 parking spaces. And that's not really fun. Nobody wants to build 700 parking spaces to house, you know, 700 people. But you create this huge inefficiency that even in downtown areas, in city centers, huge amounts of real estate are used for parking. So you kind of now have this big problem where all development is based around parking. All commercial development has to have parking. and many times it's parking for their peak use. For Black Friday, a parking lot big enough for Black Friday is going to be pretty empty the rest of the time. That's why you see these malls with huge parking lots around them, and then on any given day they're only 20-30% full, if that. In a lot of dead malls, they're 0% full. You actually need more parking than cars. You can't just have one parking spot per car. You have to have multiple parking spots per car. One where the car is parked at home, one where the car is parked at its destination. It's kind of weird when you think about it like that. Cars require a lot of land just to park. And I imagine if some people were really curious about this and you had better data than I do, and you went and you looked on a major city, how many parking spaces exist in that city, if you could figure it out, and how many cars are registered in that city, you're going to find that my guess is that the number of parking spaces is well over double the number of cars. For every one car, you need at least 2 places to park it, and probably 3 or 4, because you could be at work, or you could be at the store, or you could be at a restaurant. You have to have super abundant parking. If you're a business and you do not have good parking, well, you're not going to have a lot of customers. The result is that, and this is actually kind of where I disagree with Not Just Bikes and many people in that community, which I think they're really cool. I love what they're doing. I think that's how we should build and design our communities, is kind of the advice they're taking. Go follow them on YouTube. They're great. Not Just Bikes and Strong Towns. But I really think the main thing is parking. We don't design cities around 4,000 pound vehicles only holding a couple people. We design cities around parking. We design neighborhoods around parking. Well, if you no longer needed to own a car because you have this point-to-point transportation, what do we need all this parking for? I mean, it's a really big deal. You think, oh, well, the people who still want to drive. Okay, I agree, because they're going to want to drive to their parking space to go to the grocery store. But as land becomes more valuable and you find your customers are now not driving, they're being driven with these auto taxis, why have even all this new parking? Now, let's say you're a developer and you're building a condo unit in downtown, wherever your closest city is. You no longer need to build matching parking. And in fact, the budget that you use for parking could be put into more housing, because the people who live there will not own cars. They're going to use these services in addition to the bike and the pedestrian and using a subway or a bus. And probably not the bus. I think buses are going to go away. But I think subways will stick around and light rail will stick around. But we don't need that parking. Now, technologist Tony Seba, which from RethinkX, rethinkx.com, I think is the website. I'll link to their YouTube. They give whole presentations about what this is going to be like, and they have a new book, Rethinking Humanity, because this change is really going to change a lot of stuff. But my attitude is, I think just going from a parking-based society to a non-parking based society is going to drastically change the world. And it's going to do so for economics, because if you're a developer and you don't need to build a parking space and you can build more rent generating housing and more rent generating commercial activity, you're going to go with that. Parking is the bottleneck. It is the limiting factor. The way New York City has to work is that people just don't own cars, because if everyone owned a car, there wouldn't be enough parking spaces in the whole town for it. I think that's like people are saying, like, well, what do we do with all this land? Well, as I said, Tony Seba, he ran the numbers, and he said that within Los Angeles, and I'm almost certain he's talking about just the city, not the county or the greater metro area, there's about 150 square miles of land used for parking. Well, 150 square miles, that's 3 times the size of San Francisco. If you went with San Francisco level density, which is not mega dense, despite what people think, it's pretty dense, but it's not, lower Manhattan dense. I think it's 35 people per acre. or somewhere in there, somewhere between 30 and 40, probably closer to 30 than 40. But if you actually took all that land in LA that's used for parking and you converted it into housing, you now have enough housing for about 2.5 million people. And that's including parking, even by San Francisco standards. 2.5 million people aren't going to move to LA, but if you built that kind of housing, you're going to now suddenly see, hey, LA no longer has to be this extremely expensive city. LA could become a much more affordable place to live because the supply of housing can actually meet the demand of housing. And I think you're going to find that while some communities hold out and some communities embrace it, it's going to be pretty stark differences. And what will that do then to the suburban guy who wants to drive to LA but can't find a parking space because the parking is being converted into housing and commerce and parks and stuff that you'll actually want to use and hang out in? Well, the suburban guy is going to say, hey, I can't even drive my car into LA or downtown anywhere because there's no parking, or the parking that exists is, $50 a day or more. Well, I guess I'll take the driverless car because, that's cheap. I don't have to pay for parking. And it's going to very quickly come into, hey, well, even the suburban guy, what do they need their car for if everywhere they go doesn't have parking and there's a bunch of new development? But the consequence of this self-driving car is going to be in the construction industry. It's going to allow development that right now you can't do. You can't build huge housing buildings with no parking, and you can't build huge commercial buildings with no parking. But with self-driving taxis, you can. And here we have a traffic crisis in Southern California. We majorly have a housing crisis. Housing, it's going up and up and up every year to the point where what was entry-level housing, 30 years ago, a professional salary now needs to pay for. I don't think that's a good thing. It doesn't mean people are getting richer, it means they're getting poorer. But when you really crack down and kind of break it down, that's how we're going to solve our housing crisis. It's going to be from self-driving cars. It will have never been from mass transit. I think mass transit's useful. I use it. But I don't think any level of mass transit in Southern California would have ever permitted more than maybe 25% of the population to go without owning a car. This technology will allow 100% of the population to live without owning a car. Now, you can still own one if you want to, like an enthusiast, and enthusiasts are maybe 5% of the population, or if you need one explicitly for work, which is another 10-15% of the population. But still, I think most trips are going to be for 100% of the population, these self-driving cars. I said I'm not talking about how the technology is going to work. I'm assuming that it is going to work, but how is it going to change the world? And it's going to change the world through construction. It's going to change housing. It's going to change neighborhood designs. Why would you build a bedroom community suburb that's a completely car dependent, that has no services of any kind? Why would you build such a thing today? Or in this future, where every house has 3-4 cars parked in front of it? You wouldn't. In fact, we probably have too much of that stuff as it is, especially if they're building huge developments in major cities. If you could get an extra 2.5 million people into the city of LA, not the surrounding metro or the county, where they're comfortable, they've got all the amenities that they need, transportation, got that down, that's I think it's gonna make the suburbs a lot less appealing for people. And like I said, the suburbs aren't gonna be magically torn down, but I think that it's gonna kind of change the mentality. Now, what I'm worried about is more people saying, oh, hey, we can't build high density housing because the traffic. People are gonna be very quickly stuck in their old mentality. I'd say the existing paradigm is really, people are just kind of doubting this technology is ever gonna work. maybe we might see it starting in 15 years, and adoption in 25 years, and saturation in 40 years. There's a new Veritasium video, and I'll link to that, where he rides around in one of these cars in Arizona. There's nobody in the driver's seat, it's not being remotely driven, and it picked him up and it took him where he wanted to go. This is already happening, this is now. We're not talking about 10 years from now. And these companies are aggressively trying for the California market. I believe Cruise has been approved for some limited passenger use in San Francisco, and I believe Google Waymo is the same. And I wouldn't be surprised if Zeus, which is owned by Amazon, or Zoox, I don't know how to pronounce it, is going to receive such a thing similar. But if we have 3 companies in a major city in California all competing for, to give people rides, that's gonna be kind of like, it's gonna remind me of the late 90s internet. But I really think this is like an interesting topic, because not so much the technology, because technology, it's like talking about who's better, Alta Vista or Lycos. So who cares? What's gonna be interesting is how much different is a search engine. Search engines have changed the world. The internet has changed the world, and this is going to be the next big thing that changes the world, and it's going to do so this decade. Now the consequences will take a while to build up, the housing, but we desperately need housing, and as soon as you can build this kind of housing, I think it's going to get built. And I think parking lot owners are going to start to realize, hey, I've got this 3-acre parking lot, half a mile away from downtown Los Angeles. That would be the perfect place for a 30-story building that houses, 2,000 people, where downstairs there's, pick-up, drop-off points, and maybe even a mass transit point if you wanted. Or do I keep my land as a parking lot? Do I collect rent from 3,000 people, or do I turn it into a parking lot and keep it a parking lot? Well, I think the big wealth is gonna kind of shift the other way. I just hope cities get on it. So anyway, it's a long video. I kind of want to do these like long rambling rant videos where I just kind of do my little afternoon hike and kind of give you my spiel. And this one's self-driving cars. I definitely recommend watching the Rethink X presentation by Tony Seba, and then the new one by Veritasium, where he actually goes and rides in one of these vehicles, because this is something that we need to think of how we want to adapt to this now. And I was posting on Reddit, and it was in an urban design group, and there's something in common that the urban designers and planners hated this idea. They said, no, we do not want self-driving cars, we want only mass transit and walkable, which, yeah, mass transit and walkable, we need all that. So we don't need self-driving cars. And the reality is, we're gonna get them. And if these urban planners don't want to design a city that optimizes their use, well, they'll get other urban planners who will. And I think that's kind of the big thing that the urban planning community needs to commit on, is you guys have skills and you have abilities to make the best use of any technology. And if you're going to assume this technology doesn't exist, or we explicitly do not want it because what we really want is to get around on buses and trains, which I'll tell you, no, people don't. It's really weird. You talk to people who drive everywhere and they talk about how great mass transit is, and you talk about people who use mass transit and they just want a car. It's very strange. And considering that, at least where I live, 99% of adults don't use mass transit, I don't think that's going to change. But it's kind of not my call up, but my challenge to the urban planners is, how would you design a community where this technology does exist and people do not need to own cars? Of course, you're going to have to say, oh, well, we'll put in trains and all this stuff, but still, people are going to use these cars, these autonomous vehicles. And if your mentality is, no, not in our community, they just won't exist. If the train doesn't get you there and you can't walk there, well, that's just a place you don't go. And that's how people are going to interpret that. And guess what? You're going to be out of work, and they're going to find someone who can do the job, and you can just sit back and talk about how you got that close to getting your dream community. So I do mean to be a little harsh with the urban planners, because I want them to rise to the challenge. I think this is probably the greatest opportunity in history since going from horses to cars 100 years ago. is going to go from cars as we've known them to autonomous transportation, and it's going to require clever design. And I honestly think that designers can do that in a way that makes communities walkable, and we're not dependent on transit to do many tasks. But at the same time, if you want to go anywhere you want, whenever you want, you can do that. So anyway, probably a half-hour long video, too long, but I'm just going on these little hikes with you. That's gonna be it. You know, if you want to continue the conversation, we'll do it in the comments. But yeah, let's call this consequences of self-driving vehicles. I want to hear your take, and I'll argue with you in the comments if you leave good ones. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, follow me on Instagram at Riley O'Neill, and I'll see you next month.